March 1945. Somewhere in the American Midwest. The building is quiet in a way the women have not known for years. No shouted orders. No boots striking concrete. Just the muted sound of wind brushing the walls of a converted military barracks. A female prisoner of war steps inside a narrow room and stops. Not because she is told to, but because her body hesitates. In front of her stands a bed. It is simple. A metal frame. A thick mattress. White sheets pulled tight, unwrinkled, smelling faintly of soap. She reaches out with caution, pressing her fingers into the surface. The mattress gives way. It does not resist. It does not bruise. It does not conceal straw or wood beneath fabric. For a moment, she does not sit. Across Europe and Asia, beds had meant sickness wards, lice-infested bunks, frozen planks, or bare floors. Rest was something rationed, like food. Here, the softness feels unreal, almost dangerous. A trap, perhaps, or a test. When she finally lies down, the shock is not comfort. It is disbelief. And with that disbelief begins a confrontation not with guards or walls, but with a new kind of captivity, one that forces the mind to relearn what safety feels like, shaped by everything that came before. By the final years of World War II, the presence of women behind barbed wire was no longer an anomaly. They came from many fronts and many uniforms, drawn into captivity by a war that had erased traditional boundaries between combatant and non-combatant. Some were military nurses and medical auxiliaries, captured when hospitals were overrun or evacuation failed. Others served in communications, logistics, or air defense units, particularly within German and Japanese forces as manpower shortages deepened after 1942. Many were not soldiers at all. They were resistance couriers in occupied France, Poland, Yugoslavia, and the Netherlands. Women arrested for transporting messages, sheltering pilots, or refusing to comply with occupation authorities. By war's end, tens of thousands of women across Europe and Asia had experienced imprisonment directly tied to military operations. International law, at least on paper, offered them protection. The 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war established standards for food, shelter, medical care, and humane treatment. However, the convention had been written with male combatants in mind, and its application to women, especially civilians captured in military zones, was inconsistent at best. Enforcement depended entirely on the captor. Conditions varied sharply by theater. On the Eastern Front, German camps strained under overcrowding, shortages, and relentless movement as front lines shifted. In Japanese-controlled territories, captivity often meant forced labor, chronic malnutrition, and brutal discipline, with women receiving no special consideration. In occupied Europe, resistance detainees were frequently held in transit prisons or camps never designed for long-term survival. By contrast, the United States entered the war geographically untouched. Its prison camps were constructed far from battlefields, supplied by intact rail systems, and staffed by forces trained under strict adherence, at least officially, to Geneva standards. By 1943, the U.S. War Department oversaw more than 500 POW camps across the continental United States, primarily for Axis soldiers captured in North Africa and Europe. Women were a minority, but when they arrived, they entered a system already optimized for scale, order, and regulation. For many female prisoners transferred into American custody late in the war, capture did not come suddenly. It came after months or years of attrition, through collapsing fronts, chaotic evacuations, or transfers from Allied or Allied-occupied forces. By the time they crossed the Atlantic, exhaustion had become normalized. Hunger had reshaped their bodies. Sleep had become shallow, interrupted, or dangerous. They arrived not expecting mercy, but suspicion. American propaganda, like that of every belligerent nation, had painted captivity as unpredictable and harsh. The idea that an enemy would follow rules, let alone provide comfort, ran counter to everything war had taught them so far. And so, when these women were processed into U.S. camps, issued clean clothing, examined by doctors, and guided toward heated barracks, the experience did not immediately register as relief. It registered as uncertainty. That uncertainty would deepen as they encountered conditions unlike anything they had known in confinement before. Conditions that challenged not only their expectations of the enemy, but their understanding of what captivity itself could be. Before reaching American custody, most female prisoners of war had already learned to distrust space, silence, and stillness. In many camps across Europe and Asia, quiet rarely meant safety. It meant counting the sick, the missing, the dead. It meant waiting for inspections, selections, or transport orders that came without explanation. In German-run facilities, women held as auxiliaries or resistance detainees were often placed in overcrowded transit camps. Bedding, when provided, consisted of thin straw sacks laid directly on wooden planks. Mattresses were rare and deteriorated quickly under lice infestations and moisture. In winter, cold seeped through walls never meant for habitation. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by roll calls, searches, or air raids. The body learned to remain half alert, even when exhausted. On the Eastern Front, captivity was harsher still. As supply lines collapsed under Allied pressure and Soviet advances, camps became improvised holding zones. Food rations shrank. Medical care deteriorated. Women were often housed alongside male prisoners or civilians without adequate sanitation. Physical weakness was not accommodated. It was punished by circumstance. The concept of privacy ceased to exist. In Japanese-controlled territories, women captured as nurses, missionaries, or civilians experienced a different form of deprivation. Facilities were frequently repurposed schools, warehouses, or barracks never designed for detention. Sleeping surfaces were wooden floors or bamboo slats. Mattresses were unknown. Blankets, when issued, were thin and communal. Tropical disease, hunger, and forced labor defined daily existence. Physical rest was viewed as a luxury incompatible with wartime necessity. Transport between camps compounded the trauma. Women were moved by rail cars or trucks packed far beyond capacity. Journeys lasted days or weeks. Sanitation was minimal. The dead were sometimes transported alongside the living until stops allowed removal. By the time many prisoners reached Allied hands, often after German surrender or Japanese retreat, their bodies bore the signs of prolonged deprivation. Severe weight loss, anemia, infected wounds, and chronic fatigue. When transfer to American custody occurred, it was often sudden. Prisoners taken in Western Europe or the Pacific were processed through Allied holding areas before embarkation. Ships crossing the Atlantic or Pacific were crowded, but food was regular. Medical inspections were conducted. For many women, this was the first time in years a uniformed authority had examined them with clinical detachment rather than suspicion. Arrival in the United States did not immediately erase fear. Camps were surrounded by fences and guard towers. English commands were unfamiliar. The distance from home felt immeasurable. Yet the environment itself signaled difference. Buildings were permanent. Heating functioned. Water was clean. Latrines were separated and maintained. Most striking of all was the intention behind the infrastructure. American POW camps were designed for containment, not attrition. Beds, metal-framed, raised off the ground, fitted with cotton mattresses, were standard issue. Sheets were laundered. Blankets were sufficient. This was not luxury, but regulation. The U.S. Army's adherence to Geneva Convention standards required that prisoners receive shelter comparable to that of American troops in similar conditions. For women who had slept on dirt, wood, or concrete, the first encounter with such a bed was not merely physical relief. It was disorientation. Comfort felt suspicious. Softness felt temporary. The body, trained by hardship, struggled to accept rest without consequence. And it was in this fragile psychological space, between exhaustion and disbelief, that the deeper impact of American captivity began to take hold, setting the stage for reactions that went far beyond surprise. By the time female prisoners entered American camps, their bodies carried the record of captivity more clearly than any document. Medical examinations conducted by U.S. Army doctors in 1944 and 1945 repeatedly noted severe weight loss, muscle atrophy, anemia, and untreated infections among women transferred from European and Pacific theaters. Many were chronically dehydrated. Some had not slept on a flat surface for months, even years. Sleep deprivation had altered posture, balance, and reflexes. Women accustomed to resting in cramped positions on hard surfaces often struggled to lie fully extended. When placed on mattresses, some reported dizziness or nausea, not from softness itself, but from the unfamiliar redistribution of weight. The body, long adapted to discomfort, resisted relaxation. Psychologists attached to POW medical units observed an unexpected response to improved conditions: anxiety. For prisoners conditioned by brutality or neglect, sudden comfort created suspicion. In earlier captivity, favorable treatment was often temporary or followed by punishment. As a result, clean bedding and quiet rooms triggered fear rather than relief. Some women refused to sleep at first. Others lay rigid, fully clothed, prepared to move if summoned. Crying episodes were reported during the first nights, not from pain, but from emotional overload. The bed became a symbol not only of rest, but of everything that had been denied, making its presence overwhelming. Years of wartime messaging had taught these women that enemy captivity meant humiliation or violence. German propaganda warned of American brutality. Japanese doctrine portrayed surrender as dishonor. Resistance networks expected torture. The idea that an enemy would provide humane living conditions contradicted every narrative they had absorbed. This clash between expectation and reality created cognitive dissonance. The bed, ordinary by American standards, became extraordinary in meaning. It challenged deeply ingrained assumptions about power, mercy, and survival. Accepting its softness required more than physical rest. It required rewriting what captivity meant. And as these personal reactions unfolded quietly inside the barracks, they intersected with a larger system, one built deliberately, logistically, and strategically to produce exactly this effect. American prisoner of war camps were not improvised responses to battlefield collapse. They were planned years in advance. By mid-1942, the U.S. Army's Provost Marshal General had issued detailed specifications for camp construction, housing capacity, sanitation, and daily life. These standards applied regardless of prisoner nationality or gender. Camps in states such as Texas, Arizona, Kansas, and Iowa were laid out with deliberate spacing, permanent barracks, and centralized supply depots. Beds were not symbolic gestures. They were inventory items. Cotton mattresses were mass-produced under military contracts. Sheets and blankets moved through the same logistical networks that supplied U.S. troops. Laundries were built into camp design. Heating systems were installed to maintain consistent interior temperatures. For administrators, this was not compassion, it was compliance. The Geneva Convention required shelter comparable to that of the detaining power's own forces, and the United States had the industrial capacity to meet that obligation. American military medicine emphasized recovery through hygiene, nutrition, and sleep. Doctors assigned to POW camps treated prisoners not as enemies, but as patients whose stabilization reduced mortality, disease spread, and administrative burden. For women arriving in weakened condition, rest became a prescribed intervention. Medical reports from late war camps describe structured rest periods, weight gain monitoring, and gradual reintroduction to normal sleeping patterns. Soft bedding reduced pressure sores and joint inflammation common among prisoners who had slept on hard surfaces. Warm, dry quarters lowered rates of respiratory illness. These outcomes were measurable and documented. Humane treatment also served a strategic purpose. The U.S. government understood that prisoner welfare affected reciprocity. American soldiers captured abroad depended on the treatment their own government modeled. Moreover, POW camps became sites of ideological contrast. Order, cleanliness, and humane conditions functioned as silent counterpropaganda. For female prisoners, this contrast was especially stark. Many arrived prepared for cruelty and found regulation instead. The bed, simple, soft, unthreatening, became one of the most powerful instruments in this psychological shift. It asked nothing. It punished nothing. It simply existed. And it was precisely this absence of coercion that unsettled many prisoners most, because it signaled the turning point in captivity, one where survival was no longer the primary struggle, but adjustment was. That adjustment would reach its peak during the first nights inside American camps, when disbelief gave way to something deeper. Processing began the moment female prisoners arrived at American camps. Names were recorded, personal effects cataloged, uniforms inspected. Medical officers conducted examinations under electric light, noting injuries, malnutrition, and disease with methodical precision. For many women, this was the first time since capture that their bodies were treated as systems to be repaired rather than burdens to be endured. Delousing stations were clinical, not punitive. Clothing was cleaned or replaced. Hair was washed. Skin was examined for infection. These procedures, though uncomfortable, carried no violence. The absence of shouting was itself disorienting. Orders were given calmly, often through interpreters. Compliance was expected, but not extracted through fear. After processing, women were escorted to separate barracks. The buildings were plain, military standard structures. Inside, rows of beds stood evenly spaced, each with a mattress, sheets, and folded blankets. There were no bunk towers stacked towards ceilings. No straw. No baseboards. Windows were intact. Heat circulated quietly through vents. For many prisoners, this was the decisive moment. Not the capture, not the transport, but the realization that captivity had changed form. Some stood motionless, unsure where to place themselves. Others touched the beds repeatedly, as if testing whether they were real. Guards did not rush them. There was no immediate demand to sleep. The routine allowed space for hesitation. That evening, lights dimmed at a fixed hour. Doors were secured, but not sealed. The night passed without interruption. No roll calls. No alarms. No footsteps outside the walls. For women conditioned to sleep lightly, listening for danger, the silence was unfamiliar and unsettling. When exhaustion finally overcame vigilance, bodies lowered onto mattresses that yielded instead of resisting. Muscles loosened involuntarily. Breath deepened. Some woke suddenly, startled by the sensation of rest itself. This first night did not bring peace. It brought confusion. The mind, trained by years of deprivation, searched for the hidden cost of comfort. And as dawn approached, it became clear that the real turning point of captivity was not the bed, but what it forced these women to confront within themselves. Morning arrived without urgency. No whistles, no shouted commands. Light filtered through windows as breakfast preparations began elsewhere in the camp. For many of the women, waking was itself disorienting. The body had slept deeply, too deeply. Muscles that had remained tense for years had relaxed without permission. The result was soreness, heaviness, and a strange sense of vulnerability. Some women later described the sensation as dangerous. In earlier captivity, deep sleep had carried risk. It meant missing roll call. It meant being unprepared for inspections or transport orders. Here, nothing happened. The world did not intrude. The bed remained where it had been the night before. American camp records and Red Cross inspection reports from late 1944 and early 1945 note a pattern among newly arrived female prisoners. Emotional release within the first 72 hours. Tears came without clear cause. Some women withdrew and spoke little. Others experienced headaches or nausea. Medical staff recognized these responses as delayed shock. Psychological responses triggered not by continued hardship, but by its sudden absence. The bed became a focal point of this reaction. Its softness symbolized safety, and safety felt undeserved or temporary. Women raised in militarized cultures, particularly within Axis states, had been taught that surrender invited humiliation, that an enemy would provide comfort conflicted with deeply ingrained beliefs about power and weakness. In several documented cases, women requested to sleep on the floor during their first nights, placing blankets beneath them instead of using mattresses. Doctors discouraged this, explaining the medical necessity of proper rest. Gradually, resistance eased. Routine replaced fear. Sleep extended from minutes to hours, then through the night. This shift marked the true turning point of captivity. Survival, once measured in calories and endurance, was replaced by something more complex. The mind, no longer consumed by immediate danger, turned inward. Memories surfaced. Loss became present. The future, long suspended, reappeared, carrying uncertainty rather than threat. The bed did not erase trauma. It exposed it. By providing physical safety, American captivity removed the constant noise of survival, allowing psychological consequences of war to emerge. This was not kindness without cost. It was a transition from endurance to reckoning. And as days passed, the effects of this transformation began to appear in measurable ways, on bodies, behavior, and long-term memory, shaping what captivity would mean long after release. Within weeks of arrival, measurable changes appeared among female prisoners held in American camps. Medical logs recorded gradual weight gain, stabilized vital signs, and reduced incidence of infection. Anemia, widespread on intake, began to reverse with regular meals and uninterrupted sleep. For doctors accustomed to treating battlefield casualties, the improvement was notable not because it was dramatic, but because it was consistent. Sleep played a central role. Camp physicians reported that women who had suffered chronic insomnia began sleeping 6 to 8 hours per night after the initial adjustment period. Soft mattresses reduced joint pain and inflammation caused by prolonged rest on hard surfaces. Pressure sores healed. Respiratory conditions improved in heated, dry barracks. These outcomes were documented not as acts of benevolence, but as indicators of effective camp management. Behavioral changes followed physical recovery. Guards and administrators observed reduced agitation, fewer disciplinary incidents, and improved cooperation with daily routines. This was not submission, but stabilization. Prisoners no longer operated in constant crisis mode. The removal of extreme stress altered interactions in subtle ways. For many women, the bed became the first fixed point in a predictable day. It marked the return of routine. Sleep at night, wake in the morning, rest without interruption. Such predictability had been absent throughout much of their imprisonment. Its reintroduction reshaped how time itself was perceived. Days became countable. Weeks had structure. Psychologically, however, recovery was uneven. Some women experienced vivid dreams and night terrors once deep sleep resumed. Doctors recognized these episodes as delayed trauma responses. The safety of the environment allowed suppressed memories to surface. Camp medical staff documented anxiety attacks and emotional withdrawal alongside physical improvement. Importantly, American officials did not interpret this as failure. On the contrary, they recognized it as an expected phase of recovery. Reports emphasized patience, routine, and continued humane treatment as stabilizing forces. The bed, once a source of disbelief, became a constant, silent, unchanging, reliable. As health improved and routines settled, attention began to shift beyond survival and recovery. Thoughts turned toward the war's end, repatriation, and the uncertain return to societies that had been reshaped by conflict. And it was in this transitional space, between captivity and freedom, that the long-term consequences of this experience began to take form. As the war drew to a close, American POW camps entered a new phase. Military objectives shifted from containment to transition. For female prisoners, this period brought anticipation mixed with apprehension. Repatriation was discussed, scheduled, delayed, and rescheduled again as Europe and Asia stabilized unevenly. The bed, once shocking in its softness, remained constant as everything else became uncertain. Red Cross interviews conducted during late 1945 reveal how deeply American captivity had marked memory. When asked about their imprisonment, many women did not begin with food or guards. They spoke of sleep, of the first uninterrupted night, of the moment they realized no one would wake them abruptly. These details stood out because they contrasted so sharply with what had come before. Medical follow-ups noted that women released from U.S. camps generally returned in better physical condition than when captured, a rarity among wartime prisoners. Yet psychological reintegration proved more complex. Some women struggled to explain their experience to families who had endured bombing, occupation, or loss at home. Comfort in captivity felt morally ambiguous. Survival had come without heroism, without resistance, and without visible suffering. For resistance members in particular, this created internal conflict. They had endured hardship for a cause, only to find relief in the custody of an enemy. The bed, clean, soft, undemanding, became a symbol of this contradiction. It represented safety, but also distance from sacrifice. Long after release, testimonies collected in post-war decades continued to reference American camps as places of physical recovery, but emotional reckoning. Nightmares persisted. Some women reported lifelong difficulty sleeping on soft mattresses, associating deep rest with vulnerability. Others described the opposite, an enduring gratitude for rest that felt earned only after deprivation. Historically, these accounts complicated simplistic narratives of captivity. They demonstrated that humane treatment did not erase trauma, but it altered its shape. It shortened physical suffering while extending psychological processing into peacetime. For American military historians, POW camps became evidence of logistical capacity and adherence to international law. For the women who lived inside them, they became memory spaces defined not by brutality, but by contrast. And as the final transports carried prisoners back across oceans and borders, the experience of American captivity closed not with liberation alone, but with a lasting imprint, one shaped by something as ordinary and as unforgettable as a bed. War is often remembered through extremes, violence, endurance, destruction. Yet its deepest marks are sometimes left by quieter moments, when the struggle to survive gives way to the challenge of understanding what survival has cost. For the female prisoners of war who encountered American captivity late in World War II, that moment came not in battle or surrender, but in rest. A bed is not a weapon. It does not command, threaten, or conquer. And yet, for women shaped by years of deprivation, it carried immense power. Its softness confronted bodies trained to resist comfort. Its stillness exposed memories long buried beneath exhaustion. In offering safety, it removed the constant noise of danger, allowing trauma to surface rather than remain suppressed. Historically, American POW camps stood as examples of what industrial capacity and adherence to international law could produce even during total war. They demonstrated that humane treatment was possible without weakening military discipline. Strategically, they reinforced reciprocity. Morally, they complicated the image of the enemy. But for the women who slept there, the meaning was more intimate. The bed marked a boundary between endurance and reckoning. It signaled that survival was no longer enough, that healing, memory, and identity would now demand attention. Long after uniforms were returned and borders redrawn, the sensation of that first night lingered. Not because it erased suffering, but because it stood in stark contrast to it. In the quiet of American barracks, surrounded by fences yet free from fear, these women encountered an unfamiliar truth of war. That sometimes the most profound shock is not cruelty, but mercy.